have a record of that. I didn't ask you. Are you okay to record it or to keep it on YouTube or?
Yeah, sure. There are so many videos of me on YouTube now, so
Okay.
don't read the comments.
If you change your mind, you just tell me after that, and I can set in private. But
No, it's fine. It's fine.
okay. So everyone should be able to see your screen. Please in the chat, can you confirm that? I think it's okay. Since I've got superpower, I'm just rather check that. Yep, okay. Thank you. Well, YouTube is started. Hello, Nick. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight at the DDD French meetup. I'm very happy to have you and to host you tonight. I think that you will talk to us about a missing chapter, not a missing chapter. You will focus on one chapter of the Blue Book, apparently.
Yeah, it was Maxime Sanglant-Charlier. He came to this talk in Porto, and he calls it the missing chapter.
Okay. Hi to Maxime. I really enjoy and like whatever you are doing. So I'm a fan. I'm not objective, but I think you have a lot of fun here in France too. So maybe if you have time for questions at the end, we can have a kind of interaction with the audience, if it's okay for you, depending on
Yeah,
the time.
questions are always good. Questions are one of the main reasons to do a talk like this, so you get feedback and you get to see it from different perspectives. I was just doing a workshop before this actually, and there was an activity I've done like 10 or 20 times, and someone asked a question. I'm like, that is, I've never thought about that before, and that just like made me totally rethink it. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, always happy to have the questions.
So for the question, you have the Q&A section, guys, and people connected. Q&A session more than the chat, please, so that we can collect them and check them at the end. Okay, it's okay for me. Nick, give you the stage.
Okay,
And I will
thank
mute
you.
myself.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully you're going to enjoy this and get something useful out of it. And I'm just going to get straight into it basically. So if there are any problems with the sound or the picture or anything like that, just drop me a message in the chat. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking all the way through and we'll do the questions at the end. So first thing to note about this talk is that if you're a domain-driven design purist, you might find it very offensive, some of the things in this talk. Or maybe I'm just trolling and actually it's not that bad. It's up to you to decide, but I would always say on a pragmatic level, any book or idea is always built in a context. And in 2004, when Domain-Driven Design book was published, and if you imagine Eric Evans was working on those ideas before then, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the world was different, how we build software was different, organizations were different. And if we don't challenge things over time, we're just worshipping some Bible-like book and not challenging it. So there is a reason. I'm not trolling too much, but let me give you an example. So this is a real person. I haven't invented them. You can find this tweet on Twitter. If you disagree with it, obviously don't harass this person. They're just sharing some interesting feedback. But domain-driven design is awful. Everyone claims to understand it, has different definitions that can't be applied by others. He says to derive your domain boundaries, you may as well use tarot cards. I'm not saying I agree or disagree, I'm just saying this is an opinion someone has formed about domain-driven design. This person here is claiming about a technical jargon, which is ironic since domain-driven design sets out to address issues around jargon. We can see Dan Barua and James Morecambe having fun here, poking some concepts. Bounded context sounds arcane. James is calling them lingospheres because of the language issue. So, and then you've got a guy called Herman Pieren who says, how ubiquitous is ubiquitous language if it's only applicable within a very tightly defined context? Doesn't sound very ubiquitous. And we've got comments like this addressing the tactical parts of domain-driven design, where he's saying he's never seen a project that used domain-driven design work out well, and the code wasn't overly complex for what it needs to be. So I'm not saying I agree or disagree with any of those things. I'm just saying that there are lots of people out there who don't always get the benefit from domain-driven design or see it the way we do. And I think anything can be improved, and we should look at these ideas and think about, could things be improved? And actually, even Eric Evans himself has identified that domain-driven design can be improved. If you go and watch this talk of his from a number of years ago, he says he would just cut out the chapter at the end on large-scale structure. He would get rid of it, and he would put chapter 14, which is about strategic domain-driven design and bounded context. He would put that as chapter 2 or 3. So even Eric acknowledges that now the book's been written and he's got feedback, it could be improved. And I just thought, well, if Eric Evans is allowed to have his alternative DDD timeline, what if I was to have mine? What if I was able to go back in time and change history to make domain-driven design look different and better? So people got all of the benefits we see now, but there was less confusion and people got even more benefit from it. With hindsight, what would I do differently in my alternative timeline? So I like to be quite extreme sometimes with ideas and opinions. And I thought, well, Eric Evans talked about removing a couple of chapters. So my alternative timeline, I was like, well, what if I remove every chapter in the book, but keep one of them? Well, got to keep one chapter, but I remove every one of them. What chapter would it be? And so I would say chapter 8, Breakthrough, is the chapter I would keep. And the reason I say this is because every couple of years, I read the domain-driven design book. And every time I read chapter 8, I'm always like, this chapter is so amazing. I always forget chapter 8. And I always forget all of the good stuff in that chapter. And I'm always thinking, if people read this chapter first, they will just understand domain-driven design so much better. And a lot of those complaints and problems wouldn't exist. So I thought, well, if I give a talk about this chapter, I'll never forget this chapter. So that's the reason I put this talk together. I've done this talk at Porto, NDC Porto and NDC London a couple of times now. So getting a lot of reuse out of this one. I definitely won't forget it. So, and this was a comment from Maxime after the talk in Porto. He's now calling chapter 8 the forgotten chapter from the blue book. He tweeted that. So, part 1 is based on the first part of chapter 8. This is my narration. I'm calling it the intuitions of a seasoned domain modeler. It's not what Eric puts in the book, but I'll explain this why as we go through. So, for me, this chapter is just getting off to an amazing start, because he says, the chapter starts with, after a long New York winter of refactoring. Now, for me as a person, I've always just got so many memories of winter when the nights get dark and you just get that feeling of the end of the year's coming and it's cold and it's snowy. And I really enjoyed New York. I'm just like, I would love to have a long New York winter of refactoring. That would just be a really amazing feeling. I had Monaco in the summer a couple of years ago, New York in the winter. I did actually work for a company in New York in the winter, but only for a couple of weeks, and it was amazing. So he gets the chapter off with this start, setting a bit of context, and then he explains what's actually going on in his life and in his work. So after a long New York winter of refactoring, we had arrived at a model that captured some of the key knowledge of the domain and a design that did some real work for the application. We were developing a core part of a large application for managing syndicated loans in an investment bank. So Eric here, he's setting the context of where he is, what time of year it is, but also a bit of details about the project and about the domain they're working in, syndicated loans for investment banks. Then he says, when Intel wants to build $1 billion factory, they need a loan that's too big for any single lending company to take on. So the lenders form a syndicate that pools its resources to support a facility. So, this guy, Eric, he can tell a bit of a story. He starts with a thing about New York in the winter. And now he's talking about Intel, $1 billion factory. Now he's capturing our attention here quite interestingly. But an important point is it's not some toy to do app here. It's a serious project. We're talking big numbers. These aren't rookie numbers, if you know where that meme comes from. So then he starts telling us about what his team's working on. An investment bank usually acts as a syndicate leader, coordinating transactions and other services. Our project was to build software to track and support this whole process. So you might think I'm just reading this chapter here, and I basically am just reading this chapter to you and adding my comments around it. The guy in Porto was joking. He's like, did you just read a chapter of Eric's book as a talk? And I'm like, yeah. So hopefully my comments are adding some value, but even if not, this chapter is still worth it on its own. So here he outlines what his team's working on. Then we start to understand why it had been a long winter of refactoring. He says, we were feeling pretty good. 4 months before, we had been in deep trouble with a completely unworkable inherited code base, which we had since wrestled into a coherent model-driven design. So who's ever inherited a code base and said it wasn't completely unworkable? I'm going to trust Eric on this one and say it was completely unworkable, but anything inherited is automatically someone else isn't unworkable. So, maybe there's a bit of that going on there. We'll never know. And despite that positive message about refactoring it, they have some disconcerting signs here. They kept stumbling over unexpected requirements that complicated the design. A major example he talks about was this creeping understanding that shares in a facility were only a guideline. Don't worry too much about shares and facility in these domain concepts. You can understand the key story without understanding the domain here. But I think it's these bold words and phrases are my work. And here he's talking about unexpected requirements, which I think is interesting and a lesson we can all take away from that. Every project, every product has unexpected requirements. So they're not really unexpected. We just need to realize that once we've built the happy path, there's going to be a lot more stuff coming that we just weren't prepared for. So here's one of the points I'm adding, that after implementing the common use cases, they were now uncovering this complexity that broke their mental model of the domain. They thought they built this nice model-driven design, but now all of these edge cases were appearing, and the code base appeared to be getting out of control. Now, I think this is important. The word intuition springs to mind here because I've worked with a lot of teams that would feel like we've got these requirements, we've implemented them, that's fine. But Eric and his team here, what they're saying is, we've implemented these requirements, but the code feels too complex for the domain problem we're solving. We don't know why, but this code's too complex. And that really is one of the key points of domain-driven design and building systems in general. We want to minimize that complexity, and a good domain modeler who understands domains and modeling has this intuition that, hey, we can implement this in code, we've solved the problem, but the code's too complex. From a domain perspective, the way we've modeled this is too complex for the problem we're solving. But at this point, they don't know why. They don't know why it's too complex. It's just that feeling or intuition. So then he talks about, we had accommodated this by adding loan adjustments to the model. Refinements of this kind allowed us to keep up as rules of various transactions became clearer, but complexity was increasing, and we did not seem to be converging quickly onto really solid functionality. So again, he's talking about they were making these refinements to the model so they could continue adding the new requirements, but they weren't satisfied. They could implement the requirements, but they just got this feeling, this model is too complex. It's not a good model. So that's, again, this is where I think this is the intuitions again of a seasoned modeler. It's like what they're saying here is, we don't understand the domain. This code is too complex, but we don't know why, because we don't understand the domain. And I just think that's what a good modeler is, someone who can have those intuitions. And I think about this question, I pose this question to you personally, to everyone who's still tuned in, unless I'm talking to myself. But how many times have you worked in a team and you've thought that to yourself, or had that conversation like, hey folks, I feel like this code's too complex for the problem we're solving. I don't feel like we understand the domain well enough. I've heard lots of people saying things like, oh, this code's too complex because, we're not using the right design pattern, or we had to take some shortcuts, or we've done a bit of copy and paste and we need to make it more dry later. But I don't really hear people saying, if we understood the domain better, we could model this much more simply. So I wonder, have you had that conversation? Is that something you've seen? So what happens next is Eric is double clicking into that feeling. Like, we've got a basic design problem here, he says, and we don't know why, but this difficulty we're having is connected to that problem. So they get back to the whiteboard to investigate further. And that's when we come to part 2. Now, this is just me splitting up the chapter into 3 parts. He doesn't split it up this way. This is my splitting it up. So the next part of the chapter is when they start acting on these intuitions. And when they do that, we see the value of domain-driven design. My chair's squeaking a lot, by the way. I bet you can hear that. It's so embarrassing, probably. So they say, suddenly, one week it dawned on us what was wrong. Our model tied together the facility and loan shares in a way that was not appropriate to the business. So it's using words very carefully here, but they've got these 2 domain concepts of facility and loan, and the way those things are related or designed in the model is not matching how the business talk about these things, how people in the business talk about them and use them. And he uses the words not appropriate. He's not saying this doesn't align with the business's model, because the business probably doesn't have a model of this. There is no model that you find and discover. What he's looking at is saying, he's observing how people talk about these concepts and trying to work out, does our model reflect the way they're talking about things? Figuring out the right model, it's very subjective. You need to observe how domain experts talk about concepts and use them and create this model together. They don't just give you that. It's not like finding the nouns and the verbs. It's this level of subjectiveness, of observation, of figuring out what's going on in people's heads when they're talking about these domain concepts. So they go to the whiteboard, and then he explains, with the business experts nodding, enthusiastically helping, we hashed out a new model on a whiteboard. We talked through numerous scenarios using a visualization of the new model. So now they're getting some success. They're at the whiteboard with these business experts, and they're creating this shared model together that both the business people and technical experts feel is capturing how they all perceive the domain. And I think this, one of the words I highlighted here as well was scenarios. And there's a couple of things I would like to say here. Firstly, Eric created this model exploration whirlpool for addressing this issue as a way to work collaboratively to understand the domain better, create a better model, and verify that it works. And if you look in here, he talks about scenarios, and he says, the text is quite small, but in the top right-hand corner, he says, be concrete and be specific. And having met Eric in person, I know that's something he cares. It's quite one of his strong opinions, I would say. I think he's got a saying like, one concrete example is better than some abstract model or something. I don't remember now. It's a great quote, but I just don't remember it. So that's one of the key points here, working collaboratively with business experts, but also being specific with specific scenarios. And I would say, in my experience, one of the best techniques for this that I've discovered over the past few years is example mapping and domain-driven design. So here we've got a shopper who requests a refund, and then we've got orange domain events which represent the result of that action. But based on the scenario, it can vary. So we've got 2 to 3 weeks after the purchase, this happens, less than 2 weeks after, this happens, more than 3 weeks, and this happens. And we could be even more specific here. We could break refund down. Are there different kinds of refund, different kinds of shopper? We want to avoid saying things very generic and abstract, because with these concrete examples, you understand exactly how things work. And then you can start to generalize away from this. And so what he's talking about with the scenarios and be concrete, that matches very much in my experience as well. I can see a couple of comments in the chat, but they're not about my sound or video, so I'm going to continue and address them later. All right, so in the chapter, he then provides an example here where he is being specific. So this diagram says that the borrower has chosen to draw an initial 50 million from the 100 million committed under the facility, and he talks about the 3 lenders chip in their shares in exact proportion. So he's got concrete numbers plugged in here, 50, 100, 3 lenders, and he, probably in reality he was much more specific than this as well. So I would say 99.95% of my job is saying to someone, let's talk through a concrete example of how this works. That is very often such an easy consultant trick, but just talk through real concrete examples. Example mapping in an event storming session. It's just such a simple hack, such a powerful technique. So I'm definitely recommending you try that more often if you're not already. So back to the story. Eric and his team, they had 2 deep insights. They realized investments and loan investments were 2 special cases for general fundamental concept: shares. Shares of a facility, shares of a loan, shares of a payment distribution. So by talking through these examples, they had these discoveries about the domain itself. And then, on the basis of this new way of looking at the domain, he says, all those scenarios before he was talking about that were making the code very complex, suddenly they could fit all of those extra unexpected requirements into their model, and the model was much simpler. So they got together, they spent some time with business experts, they went through concrete scenarios, following their intuitions, and now they've made this big breakthrough, which improves their domain knowledge. And that's reflected in simpler code, which is going to be much easier to change and evolve in the future. So there's some value there. And key point of breakthroughs he talks about in the book, and it matches my experiences, when you make one breakthrough, it leads you to a path of making the next breakthrough. Like, we discovered this problem here. We understand this concept of the domain better now. And at some point later, that will lead you to the next thing. Now we understand this. I realize we don't understand this part over here. So the breakthrough is a cycle he talks about, and I've seen that too. But despite all of this optimism, the story takes a dramatic twist. Our new model worked really, really well, and we all felt sick. As with every project, they were under a severe deadline, and the project was already dangerously behind schedule. So now we get to part 3. I'm calling this part, the final part of the chapter, modeling as an investment. So is this going to be a happy ending, or is all of this collaboration for nothing, and they just have to stick to getting the work hacked in to meet their deadline? Let's find out. So Eric makes a great point. The gospel of refactoring is that you always go in small steps, always keeping everything working. We've all heard this, right? But to refactor his code to a new model would require changing a lot of supporting code and there wouldn't be many stable stopping points in between. You know, this idea of let's make a lot of small refactorings to get from this model to this model, not going to work here, because the new and the old model are so fundamentally different. This small iterative approach just isn't going to work here, he says. So Eric talks to his project manager. He explains the situation that if we build a better model, it's going to be much better in the future. We'll go much faster in the future. But there's a risk here. This big deadline they've got coming up. Can they afford to refactor the model now? And the project manager said to Eric, yeah, I'll handle the heat for you. Go ahead and do it. And this is deliberate here. Eric says, I've always had tremendous admiration for the courage and trust it took for him to make that decision. And what I want to bring your attention to is, well, 3 questions. Firstly, what would you have done in Eric's situation? Would you have pushed to refactor the model, even with this big deadline risk coming up? I mean, refactoring a model, it's a lot of work, and the system still works in exactly the same way. There's no business benefit to that. Have you ever done it? Have you ever delayed investing in new features to do modeling? How did it work out for you? And the third question, which I think is the most interesting for me here, do you have a good relationship with your project and product managers that you could have that kind of conversation? Do you know if you want to create a great model in your code that's easy to work with in the long term, and you have to make these difficult decisions in these difficult situations, have you built good relationships with the people who are working in and around your team who will be affected by your decision to delay delivering work and refactor? And if not, that might be your biggest opportunity to have better relationships if you want to have better code. Anyways, let's continue, because there's something even more interesting in this final part of the chapter. So Eric says, SharePie became the unifying theme of the whole application. Technical people and business experts used it to discuss the system. And he says marketing people used it to explain the features to prospective customers. So this concept of a SharePie that they invented for their design has now moved into the business. They were trying to understand the domain better to improve the software model. They came up with this concept of a SharePie, and now even the marketing people are using it to help sell the product. So I find that really interesting as well. Miro's gone out of presentation mode. Just gonna have to drop it back 2 seconds. I think we're back. All right, so the observation I've got from that, and this is an observation a very strong feeling I have about domain-driven design, is there's often an idea that we work with domain experts, we take their requirements and we create a domain model based on that. But I think it goes much more the other way. I feel like as software developers and people working in teams with developers, we have an opportunity to change the domain itself. We shouldn't see the domain as a fixed thing. In this example, Eric and his team introduced this new concept of a SharePie. They added this new domain concept. You know, in other teams I've worked with, you've got engineers who are suggesting new product and feature ideas. That's one of the great things about an event storming session. Someone might say, we've got a very inefficient process here. Why don't we automate this step or add another step over here? You know, and you're changing the domain there, you're changing the business processes, you're changing the product. And I think that's a very liberating feeling when you realize we can improve the software by not just understanding the domain better, but we can change the domain as well. If the code's difficult, maybe the domain can be simplified to make the code simpler. So I don't really feel like there's enough of that happening. And I think I encourage more of this, get teams closer to the product. And over the past 10 or 15 years, since the domain-driven design book was published, this area of how we build products has changed a lot. The way modern product management works is we do much more discovery, shorter feedback cycles, and people building the software, they're not a separate IT department in the basement anymore. We've got teams formed of business and technology people working together. And this, in fact, is where the best ideas come from, according to product people like Marty Kagan. So I think this is the new reality we're working in, and the new reality that domain-driven design needs to adapt to. That we shouldn't just encourage people to understand the domain better, to model it better. We should encourage people to change how the domain works. If you're involved in some aspect of building product in a domain, then you have domain expertise, you have knowledge of the domain. You can equally change the domain itself, not just your product. Let's continue. So my questions here are, how do you feel about that? Do you agree with Marty Kagan that many of the best ideas come from engineering people, like developers and testers and architects, or the best ideas? And in his example, are the teams you work with empowered to do that? Because if you answer no to the first question, the problem could be that your organization doesn't have a culture, or even just your team particularly, where you're not closing the gap between domain experts and engineering people. And maybe that's the biggest opportunity in your team or organization, to get engineers more involved in the domain and the product, and get them contributing more product ideas. So the chapter's coming to an end now. So Eric says, just weeks after the release of the SharePy version of the software, we noticed another awkward aspect of the model that was complicating the design. And it's kind of what we talked about here earlier about, where you have one breakthrough. I think the slides might be out of order actually, but understanding the domain is a journey, and the more knowledge and momentum you build, the more of these breakthroughs you continue to have. And every breakthrough in your domain understanding is an opportunity to improve your model in the code and make your code simpler. So there is a benefit to doing this. So by continuing to search for those breakthroughs, it's building momentum for even more breakthroughs after that one. And so this is where we get to the point about DDD being an investment. And I think this is a real key point that sometimes gets lost. Eric says, our pace of development was accelerating at a stage where most projects are beginning to bog down in the mass and complexity of what has already been built. And if you think about software projects, we have this idea that as we evolve code, we get more code, it gets more complex, we take more shortcuts, and it's harder and harder to make changes to the code. But what we don't think about is, at the same time, us engineers, we're getting more and more knowledge of the domain, and that should make it easier to implement new features. So if we continue to get closer to the domain and update our model, it makes sense that we should be able to implement new features faster and not slower. The knowledge of the domain is a counterbalance for the complexity of software, and there's a relationship between those two things. And so I tend to think of it this way. Maybe I'm being a bit provocative here, but at the start of a project, blank canvas, clean code base, you can add features very quickly. But then you have to decide, what kind of journey do you want to go on? Do you want to keep implementing features as quickly as possible, and 1 year later you've got an old car that's rusty, doesn't work, everyone hates touching it? Or you can take your Formula One car speed and get even faster and turn it into a spaceship if you continue to invest in understanding the domain, improving your domain knowledge, and seeking for those breakthroughs. Would I say this is universal? No. I would say this adventure applies more so to complex domains with lots of business rules and complex domain concepts for generic and simple supporting domains, maybe the correlation is less relevant here. So that's something I'm going to keep an eye on for sure, to understand what are the characteristics of a subdomain or a domain where the increased knowledge of the domain outweighs the cost of software getting more complex over time. Anyway, getting to the end now, so I'm going to wrap things up very shortly. If you are new to domain-driven design, or you want to be able to apply some of the concepts in this chapter, working closely with domain experts, thinking about core domains, how to do things like example mapping, I would say the DDD crew that we've been working on has tried to create a nice onboarding ramp for people who are new to domain-driven design. If you've got experiences where you've got these words that don't make sense, or those comments at the start of the talk where people were having problems, the DDD crew is set out to help you get more of the benefits we talked about in this talk and avoid the traps and problems. So I guess my alternative timeline would be, I would go back 20 years, and when Eric is launching his book, we would create the DDD crew at the same time, perhaps. Maybe it's my timeline, I can do anything I want to. So yeah, I'm going to do that. And so I always find it a bit tricky when you try and give some takeaways from a talk, because there are lots of things you can take away from chapter 8 in the book, and yours might not match these 4, but here are 4 recaps of things that always jump out to me. So firstly, if you're having problems changing your code or finding it difficult to implement new features, you might actually have very clean code, well tested, applying all the good design principles and practices, but it might be your understanding of the domain that's the problem. So I think always asking yourself the question, developing that intuition, is this code more complex than it should be for the domain problem we're solving? Second takeaway, the one I would probably emphasize the most based on my experiences, is the domain drives your design. You model the domain, implement it in software, but that's not the only thing you can do. It also works the other way. You can drive the domain. You can identify opportunities in the domain to add new concepts like SharePy, to change current processes, to simplify things, to add new capabilities. That is something I strongly believe, and the product management community is talking about, getting the engineering people and domain experts closer together, really reducing that gap. Third takeaway is about design as an investment. Thinking back to Eric and his project manager, that was that was pretty risky. That this big deadline's coming up, they're already late, but this investment paid off massively. They had the breakthrough, the simple model, identified the SharePy concept, the marketing team were using it. They got to the point in the project where things get slow and they were adding features faster. That was a make or break moment. But think about that, Eric and his team and the project manager. How many project managers or similar people like product managers have you worked with who would understand what you're saying about refactoring the model and support you making that decision? I think, I'm not going to put a number on it, but it's close to a small number that's less than 20%, I would say, maybe. And finally, going back to my very first slide, if you think about all the things in this chapter, we didn't talk about bounded context. We didn't talk about ubiquitous language. We didn't talk about entities. We didn't talk about aggregates. We didn't talk about ubiquitous language. All that DDD jargon wasn't in this chapter. You can achieve all these benefits and goals of domain-driven design, even if you don't do it by the book and follow and use all that terminology. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying don't focus on those things. The principles and ideas in this chapter is where you really should focus, in my opinion. And so I believe in my alternative timeline, if people understood this, if people got the idea of chapter 8 first, then they would realize that all of these abstract concepts and technical patterns. Oh, that's just, yeah, one way of doing it. But all these principles and ideas, perfect. So 3 quick questions to finish the talk. You don't need to answer them, but you can if you want to. I'll be keen to hear your thoughts and share mine in return. So what would your alternative DDD timeline be? You've seen mine. Get rid of all the chapters and just have chapter 8. Don't have to be that extreme. Which part of this talk stands out to you the most? I think there are so many things in chapter 8, and I didn't pick up on all the interesting things. So which parts of the talk are jumping out to you, and why do they stand out to you? Maybe there's something there that you can follow up on. Maybe go back and read chapter 8, think about that a bit more, and maybe there's a next step for you there to apply some of these ideas in the team you're working with. And it's my responsibility to take you out of my alternative timeline and back to the original DDD timeline. And I have now done so. You are back in that timeline. I hope you enjoyed the journey. And that's the end of the talk.
Thank you, Nick. Great talk. I think great topics. We don't have a lot of questions so far, so I hope people will wake up and share their questions if they have. Really nice. I wanted to troll a little bit on the chat saying there is no aggregate in that talk. Is it really a DDD talk? But you answered to the thing and to the cargo cult thing at the end, so I didn't have to post it. No, that's great. Do we have one question?
It doesn't have to be a question, by the way. If anyone wants to just raise a topic, or if anyone wants to answer my questions with their thoughts, or any of the other questions in the talk, you're very welcome to do that. I'll drop the link in the chat, so you can go back and look at all the slides. Cool. It's exit presentation mode. So there's no password on this. Just going to do that now. There's the Miro board. Feel free to have a zoom around at all the slides. If you want me to go back to any of them or ask a question or anything, feel free to do that.
Could you please zoom on your own questions, Nick, please? Not the last, but the one before the last with your own questions. So
this one, yeah, okay.
Yeah, your questions, yeah. Interesting topic. So I think there is one question. Maybe we can take that from Bertrand. Is it really possible to have an abstraction on the domain level? I mean, a loan might implement entity. Nevertheless, loan does not seem to be something abstractable.
I don't understand the domain well enough. That would be a question for Eric. You could maybe get him on next month and ask him to tell you about this story and go through he could take you through the whole model and everything.
In particular, yes.
He's obviously got a lot of domain knowledge. He made all those breakthroughs in the domain. He invented SharePy, so yeah, he could probably answer those questions. If you do manage to get him to come along, please invite me.
All right, we'll try. Eric is busy. What I really like was a constant tension between delivering short-term value versus delivering value at regular pace in the long run. And I think it's even harder when the product people get used to the former models or former concepts that are associated to an application or to a platform. And I don't know if you have experienced such things like a poor model, but that has been adopted years after years by the people here.
So there's a couple of things I would say in response to that point. The first one is a bit to the side, is Eric and his team might have been wrong, right? They could have just been these DDD hippies who love modeling and wanted to create a nice model. There might not have been any benefit to creating a better model. And we always have to ask ourselves that question. Are we creating a better model just because we can and it's the right DDD thing to do, or is there a benefit to that? So, if I was a project manager and even if I knew all this stuff, I'd still have to wonder, can I trust these people will it really be a better model, or are they just like being DDD geeks? To answer your question more directly, where the business get used to a model, the first thing that came to my mind is when I worked at Salesforce, and I was working in Marketing Cloud, and they were building some advertising tools to run on Facebook and other social networks, and they had conformed to the Salesforce to the Facebook domain model. But then Facebook released more versions of their marketing API with a completely new model, changing the words of some concepts. And then you had people who worked in different companies. And so they all had these different words for the same concept, like ad set, ad group, creative. And I would say there wasn't just one bad model, there were multiple bad models, and the code was just all over. The code was just a complete mismatch of all these different models, different versions of Facebook, these different domain experts. One domain expert who uses this word, another one who uses a different word, and the developers have put both of them in the code in different places. But maybe that's not exactly what you were talking about. A good example of where the business has got attached to a bad model. I'm trying to think of a good example. I'm getting a strong feeling there, that always happens. What would be a good one?
And it's even frustrating because sometimes you can have a design breakthrough with one or two people based on what the bad side of the model, of the existing model is about, tackling some really strong problem you have, etc. And then you have the design breakthrough, but you can't manage to convince everyone to follow it. And then you're in a situation that may be frustrated. Did you experience that?
Yeah, I've got an example now. I worked for an Austrian company a few years ago, and all the code was in German, but that wasn't the problem. They had these massive events with a full aggregate on it, maybe even 2 aggregates. It was huge. And we were like, there's different concepts in there. It makes sense to split them up. And then we can have different messages in the code. That was really, the domain experts thought of this as one big concept, and it was represented in software as this one big concept, and everything has to belong together. I would say another one actually is where the domain, this one's a good one. The domain expert was talking about the customer data. And I was saying, I don't think customer data is a thing. Because if you think about a customer, you've got all this different stuff about their orders, their loyalty, their profile. Customer data isn't a thing. It's all different kinds of data. It's not a domain in your company. It's not something you should build as one separate thing with all your business rules in there. And they were like, no, it is. We're going to have a customer data domain. And we showed them through modeling that it's going to be much easier to have multiple teams working on this if you split this up and you try and separate those different concepts. And they were like, we're having the customer data platform. Fini.
And then in some situations, I've seen that a lot. Users get used to see some labels and things part of an existing application. And then their daily job is to deal with those concepts, to deal with those labels exposed by the application. And then sometimes, I don't know if you experience that also, sometimes you have people that forget the domain really and used to some existing workflows from an application, existing vocabulary also, and terminology, etc. And it was one of the most painful experience from my perspective to work like this and to have people that are really happy to stay with the what one day some IT tech guys are putting there, and they used to, and they I don't know if something that you experience also, but you know what I mean?
Could you replay that one? I guess, are you saying, could you repeat that one more time? I think I get the gist, but maybe not fully.
Okay, so I've seen some situations where end users and product people get used to some technical concept exposed by the technical guys
Oh
in one
yeah,
application,
yeah, for sure.
and
Yeah, for sure.
they learn and they used to play with that, and they're talking with technical terminologies,
Yeah.
thinking that they are doing their job, but actually the domain is kind of hidden by that first screen of application. And
Yeah, I wrote a blog post about almost 10 years ago now. I was working in the travel industry. Well, I was a consultant working with a travel company. And there was a domain expert who was responsible for managing and setting up holidays and offers and things like that with internal systems. And in the blog post, we talk about this confusion. But basically, the gist is the domain experts were talking about some database field, like,
yeah,
oh, this ID in the orders database. So yeah, those technical concepts become part of the business language, and that's just crazy.
the concept of field I've experienced a lot in lots of situations in lots of companies and customers.
Yeah.
Field was a thing for them, but actually when you were talking with the old person, well, not the old, but the old domain expert, it was just a fad. It was something that has just been extracted from the software, and they keep it as a concept, but it was hard to distinguish what has really value, what brings value, and what was old habits. And
Well, then you get when the domain experts start talking about technical implementation details, then the next step from that is often they'll start talking in solutions like, oh, for this new requirement, I want you to change that field in the database. And you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. This is not the right level of abstraction to be talking about requirements. I think it's good when product people want to understand the software and the implementation, but very often it's not in that context. Very often it's more of the technical concepts have leaked out and that's become part of the language, but the domain experts don't really understand the technical implementation enough to be having that conversation, and it gets a bit messy.
yeah, most def. Also, I can't see any question. We have comments.
Yeah, some nice comments in the chat about people sharing some similar experiences.
Absolutely. SK application with a master field notion. Yeah, master field. Field. The field is a quite common. I would say design smell, maybe. I don't know. There are fields where fields may apply and bring value, but I used to consider it as a design smell or analysis smell in most of the cases.
Yeah. So data is one of my trigger words. I worked with an engineer once. We built a new API, and he called it /data. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. You can't. I don't. That's not a business term. What data is it? Let's think of a good name here. I was polite about things, but in my head I was like, going crazy. You can't. And whenever I see the word data in an event storming session or conversation, I'm always asking what kind of data, what's in the data, because very often you've got people see this big ball of data, but there's multiple bits in there, and it's for different purposes, and it can be hinting at different processes, different domain boundaries.
Interesting comment from Nicolas Savon also on the chat. It's because the app gets used as a training of newcomers, and then the domain is shrinking. And yeah, I've seen that in lots of situations. Absolutely. The only discussions or domain-related discussion that people had so far was just using and experimenting the software and not discussing and not having chat about the domain with other people and real people. And there's also a thing that I really like in your talk, and is design as an investment. Really, yeah, it was a big decision from the project manager working with Eric to say, okay, go. I'll take the hit, and go and do your refactoring things of your model, etc. And I think there is a constant tension. I see that during my career between short-term delivery from product people and versus long-term at regular pace. What I really like in extreme programming. And it makes me think about a sentence that Jean-Baptiste Dussault, one of my friends, is saying a lot is today's quality is tomorrow's productivity or tomorrow's time to market. And I think we should embrace that more or tell the message or bring this message more.
Yeah. I feel like if you were to get to the crux of that problem, I feel like it's a trust problem. I feel like engineers are the experts of code and implementing domains. So if they say, we need some time to refactor this, they're the experts. We should trust them. If the business expert says, we think that building this will give us an advantage in the market, let's build it. The engineers can have some input into that, but we generally trust that they've got some reasoning for that. But when it comes to engineers, very often there's not that trust. And I was talking to a CEO recently, and he said, all my engineers have OCD. They're always talking about refactoring and rewriting stuff. And I think that's a good example of this lack of trust, of not understanding why that's important. So if engineers aren't trusted to do those things, then they can't have the right level of quality. Whereas in my experience in the companies that have had a really strong culture of TDD, pairing, mobbing, design principles, lots of learning during working hours, there's been trust there for the teams to do those things. And I often think, having the right CTO or the right VP of engineering who can explain why it's important and create a space for teams to do that is such an important thing, to get that environment where teams have the trust and the business know if our engineering team take a week to refactor that, we know that the business outcomes and the business benefits will be worth it because we trust them. It doesn't always need to be, you do whatever you want, we trust you. Sometimes there's a negotiation there. It might be, yeah, we understand that a week of refactoring is important, but actually this deadline is really, really important. So there can be a negotiation aspect, but still with trust. And sometimes the engineers I don't want to be harsh here, but don't deserve the trust. Sometimes engineers want to rewrite stuff or rebuild stuff, but they aren't the kind of company with applying concepts like TDD and creating quality code. And I think lots of times engineers do want to just refactor stuff and rebuild stuff, and they can't communicate in business terms why it's useful because often it's not. So I think it is difficult to build that trust. I would never say to a project manager or a product manager, just trust your engineers, because I wouldn't trust them myself. I would need to work with them to work out, do I feel like this team is working at a level where when they say they need to refactor, they should refactor, that's the right thing to do. So yeah, very, very difficult one, the trust relationship. I think trust is the key to it. There are perspectives on both sides why it's hard to build that trust. But I think when the CEO is saying, my developers have got OCD, now there's not respect there either. There's respect and there's trust, and you need both of them. And in that situation, there was neither.
Yeah, then you have a situation, clearly. And I do agree with what you are saying. There are situations where I've seen a lot, people were very keen to put some technical stuff, and the refactoring were not driven by the pain or by the gain so much. And in that case, you need to have some serious discussions all together to mitigate that and to collectively realize, okay, we can, looking at the technical debt we have, what will be the most impacted thing that we can, or a problem that we can tackle, and to see that instead of, I would like to replace that part with I don't know, an event source thing here, and etc., etc. So there is that kind of level of discussion that we need to have. But once you have the yes, the confidence altogether, in my company we experienced a month of refactoring. It was a refactoring Christmas. We take a month to make that, and I was blown by the quality of what has been outcome, and it was all self-organized. Just some Miro board kickstart. What are our main zone of pain, and we vote for that, and then multiple groups, and it brings us a lot of value, right directly after that period, but also 4 months after, because we have produced something that helped us a lot, and it was not expected, but actually it was really helpful. So this is a kind of thing that I think we should foster more and more. But maybe 1 month, yeah, it's important, but it brings a lot of value also sometimes.
Well, I think there's another implication in your story there, which is you did the refactoring, and 4 months later there were some benefits from that. So if you're a team in a company that has a low trust, you've got to try and find opportunities like that to build trust, where the business experts and the leadership and the managers are realizing we've got a good team here. When they invest in something, we get some benefit from that. In the companies I've worked for, teams deploying 3 or 4 times a day to production, the business can see that, and they know we're working at an elite level here. When these engineers ask for some time to learn something new or rebuild something, there's already a level of trust there. So I would say, yeah, trying to take small steps to get to the point where you can do a month of refactoring, identifying opportunities to build your credibility on a smaller scale. Because I mean, if I was in a low trust company like that, I wouldn't want to say, let's have a month of refactoring, because that's a big investment and the business will want to see something big out of that. So I would want to start smaller, try and build trust in other ways. Like, I think, yeah, reducing deployment frequency is always a good one, to show you're delivering more often if that's a possibility. But also getting closer to the business, showing you understand their situation better. If you introduce practices like example mapping or event storming, I've had great experiences with example mapping, where the business have put an idea, we've example mapped it, we've uncovered all of these hidden rules and edge cases, and the business have been like, wow, didn't realize it was so complex. We're going to take that away and think about that a bit more. So that's another chance where either you show the business your technical quality and standards are high, or you try and understand what their world better by talking more about the business and the requirements in the domain space. That can also build trust.
Yeah, clearly. We've got some comments. I don't know if you have 5 more minutes. Is it okay for you, Nick? Just 5
Sure.
minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'm okay for a bit longer.
Cool. Julien Sarrazin, which is saying, I like the idea of engineering teams that can take time to understand what are the boundaries of the current context they're working on. But sometimes the compressed timeline you mentioned forced engineers to take quick shortcuts and limit them on the perspective of creating the optimal design. I hope you understand my bloody accent. Huh? In your opinion, what is the appropriate starting size or right moment to implement DDD the way you mentioned?
It's going to have a few moments to think about that. So let me pick out some of the keywords in that question, because there are some themes jumping out to me here. So take time to understand the boundaries, context of what they're working on. You've got a compressed timeline. So I think, the compressed timeline is a word that jumps out there. The first thing is, why is it a compressed timeline? And what would be the consequences of not hitting it? I'm always, deadline is one of my trigger words. Is it a real deadline, or is it an artificial deadline that's been imposed for some other reason? So maybe that's negotiable. whereas sometimes it is a hard deadline for a certain reason. So that would be something I clicked into to try and negotiate that. In a low trust environment where that kind of conversation is not possible, I think the most important thing is to deliver. If you don't deliver, there's going to be problems with that. So people will start having even less trust in you. So I feel like in a low trust environment, it's important to deliver on time, firstly, unless you can change the culture of deadlines, unless you're ready to take on that conversation. But then as a result, you end up with a suboptimal design. So what's the appropriate starting size or right moment to implement DDD the way you mentioned? So in my experience, one of the ways to implement something in this talk that actually pays for itself very quickly is example mapping. So with the Austrian company I was talking about, we got these requirements from the business and the deadline for it, like you will deliver this in the next sprints. Obviously, the team uncovers all these edge cases and missing requirements, like Eric talked about in the story, and the team doesn't deliver anything in the sprints. And the business says, you never deliver anything. So the team are like, well, if we're going to be responsible for a deadline, we're going to have to be more involved in that. So what we did was, and I'm not bragging, but it was my idea. I said, let's do some example mapping. So in the sprint before, we'll do the example mapping for so in each sprint, we'll take 1 hour per week to do example mapping for the next sprint's work. And by doing that, we got the whole team involved, talking about the business requirements. The whole team, all the developers and testers were looking for all these examples and edge cases that were missing. And they always found loads. Developers are good at that, and testers especially, finding all these edge cases that people haven't thought of, like, what if this vehicle blows up? It's an edge case, and if you're writing the code and you ask yourself, what should I do if the vehicle blows up, if it just doesn't exist anymore? You then have to stop and think, clarify the requirements or make an assumption. And both of those things are risky. And very often the team were coming up with very realistic and relevant examples. So then we would give the examples back to the business. They would sign off on the ones they wanted and the ones they didn't. And they actually loved it. And they said, we want all of the other teams to do this as well. And then the team was hitting their deadline all the time. So getting closer to the business with example mapping, 1 hour every 2 weeks is not a big investment. I think you can stretch to that. And very often the domain experts and product people like it as well. They start enjoying these sessions as well, if you can get that first session. And then the delivery improved, delivering consistently every sprint. So that increased trust in the team. So I would say there are small things like that you can do straight away, and example mapping is one of them. Where you go from there, I guess that's getting a bit more difficult. About that part one of the chapter was about those intuitions. So the intuition is the code is too complex for the problem we're solving. That is not something you can put on a scale of like, now's not the right time, now's the right time. There isn't that like sudden switch over. It's like, what do we feel here? I imagine when Eric was talking to the project manager, even he didn't know if it was the right time. He felt strongly it was, but he must have had some doubts himself. So that's the intuition. If you keep trying to understand the domain better and refactoring your model when you can in small ways and build up that intuition, you'll be more likely to be correct about the bigger things. But then there's also in Eric's example, they had the share pie, the marketing team loved it, it became a big thing. But in your situation, you also need to weigh up, even if we are right, will people recognize we were right? If we spend a week refactoring the model, will anyone actually notice the benefits of that refactoring? And as Thomas was saying earlier, there was a 4-month lead time on that. 4 months later, people have forgot what you did. All these other crises and urgent deadlines have come up in that time. So, it's about playing that game, really, about having the trust, building the trust to be able to do it, and also in some way being able to show that it was successful. But there are other things you can do, like, you know, writing blog posts, talking at meetups, talking about these things outside your company, and then people inside your company might start seeing that, oh, they're confident talking about this stuff. Maybe we should trust them a bit more. So yeah, building the trust, picking the right moments, it's a lot of intuitions involved there. But I think example mapping is a quick win that most teams could do. So I would definitely encourage that one.
Yeah, and sometimes asking for an external consultant to give some help may help, because yes, there's a sentence, I don't know how to translate it, but it's nul n'est prophète en son pays. No one is prophet in his own country, or something like that. In France, we have this kind of expression, meaning if you are here for a long time, people won't stop to listen to you, and if someone else is joining the team like an external consultant, people will hear it maybe more easily.
Could you tell me that phrase, how it is in French?
Nul n'est prophète en son pays. No one
Nul
is
n'est
nul.
prophète dans son pays.
Ouais, en son pays ou dans son
En
pays.
son pays.
Ouais, en son pays.
Okay.
And sometimes you need to ask some help, from external help, to bring that trust and to show to some people that they can trust the team, because actually they are making some good job or interesting stuff. And
It doesn't always work out though. Sometimes the CEO thinks you're going to come in as a consultant and tell everyone what they think is the right way, and you're like, wait a minute, I'm not here to just toe your like party line here and make you look good. It's like, you know, you're the problem here. You've got to change some of your thinking. So yeah, the consultant is an option, yeah, but it doesn't always work out.
Absolutely, actually. Okay, one will never be a king in one's own land. I don't know if there is something which ring a bell in English, but
I've not heard of that one.
Okay,
but
it's an idiom. No, it's very idiomatic. So okay. Well, Nick, thank you very much for your time, for your great talk. It makes me, it gives me the idea to reread the chapter 8 and maybe more of the Blue Book. So thank you for that.
Great chapter, never disappointing to read it. Always love it.
Yeah.
Always surprises me. Every time I read the book, I'm like,
different
so good.
takeaway. Absolutely. So thank you very much again for your time, and talk to you soon in the real world, in the real life.
That would be amazing. Hopefully so, yeah.
Okay. Hi everyone. Have a good nice evening. Talk to you soon. I'll end the record. Oops. Sorry, I'm just trying to find